The third week of her service, on the night of the autumn reception, the silver pot slipped in her hands and the tea went down the front of the most important man in the room. It happened in the half-second, after a footman fainted at the door, and the under-housemaid was pushed forward to carry the tray. No one had trained her to carry. Esme felt the handle turn against her glove, felt the weight tip, and then the scalding amber arc was already falling, already darkening the pale gray silk of a waistcoat that had cost more than she would earn in a year, already spreading across a chest that did not flinch. The room went silent the way a room goes silent before a verdict. 40 guests in their diamonds and their dark coats turned at once toward the tall man by the fire, and 40 guests waited for him to do what such a man was entitled to do. He looked down at the ruin of his waistcoat. Then he looked at her. Esme had been told what would happen if she failed. She had heard it from the housekeeper and from the other maids, and from the very air of the house, which seemed built to remind a girl of her place. She braced for the cold word, the lifted hand, the order that would put her in the street before morning with no character, and no wages, and nowhere on this earth to go. She kept her eyes on the wet silk because she could not bear to lift them. What the Marquess of Selcourt did instead was reach out and steady the tray. His gloved hand closed over the silver edge, an inch from her own, taking the weight she had lost so that the second cup did not fall. His voice, when it came, was very low-pitched for her, and not for the room. He told her she was not burned, and it was not a question. He asked it, as a man asks who has already looked and seen the answer. She managed to say that she was not. And the whole glittering court of his guests stood frozen, because a Marquess had bent his head toward a housemaid in a stained apron, as though she were the only person present worth the bending. That was the moment they would all talk of afterward. That was the reaction that stunned them. The truth of it, though, the thing not one of those 40 guests understood, lived in the half-instant before the tray steadied, when Esme had looked up at last and seen the fine sheen of sweat at his temple and the gray cast beneath his color and the small betraying tremor in the hand that reached for hers. She had seen it because she had been taught to see it. And what she said next, in a whisper meant for no one but him, was not an apology. You may not credit a story that turns on a spilled cup of tea. Stay a moment longer, and you will understand why the spill was the smallest part of it. To understand Esme Lark, you must go back, past the reception, past the grey house, on the square, to a parsonage in a green Hampshire valley, where she had once been the daughter of the place, rather than the lowest servant in it. Her father had been the rector there for 20 years, a gentle, bookish man who married late and buried his wife, young, and raised his only child among his Latin and his bees and his shelves of pressed herbs. Her mother, before she died, had been the one the village came to when the doctor was 3 valleys away and the fever was in the cottages. From her mother, Esme had learned the willow bark for the heat in the blood, the feverfew for the aching head, the bark from the New World that the apothecaries called Jesuits' powder and sold by the grain to those who could pay. She had learned to read a sickness in a face the way her father read Greek fluently, without seeming to try. Then the rector died in his sleep in the spring of her 19th year, and the living passed to another man, and the parsonage passed with it, and Esme passed out of the only world she had ever belonged to. There had been no fortune. A clergyman who gave his tithes back to the poor and spent his stipend on books leaves a daughter nothing but her letters and her hands. A distant cousin found her the place at Selcourt House through a Christian sense of duty that did not extend to visiting. And so the rector's daughter became Esme the under-housemaid, who blacked the grates before the family woke and carried the coal up the back stairs and learned to be invisible, because invisibility was the one mercy the house allowed her. She did not weep over it where anyone could see. That was the first thing the other servants noticed, and the first thing they could not understand. The new girl did her work and kept her own counsel, and at night, in the narrow attic she shared with 2 others, she read by the stub of a candle she bought from her own wages, a small green book of her mother's hand, the receipts for every remedy the valley had trusted. The thin gown the house gave her could not quite manage the November cold, and her hands cracked at the knuckles from the lye and the coal, and her shoes had been mended at the heel until there was little heel left to mend. She bore all of it, the way she had been raised to bear things, which was quietly, and without the comfort of being seen. The man whose tea she would one day spill was, in those first weeks, hardly more than a footstep on the floor above, and a name spoken with care below stairs. The Marquess of Selcourt had come into his title young and his fortune late, and between the two had served his years abroad with the army in the fever country of the Indies, and had come home 3 winters past with a chest of campaign medals and a recurring illness that no one in the house was permitted to discuss. He was the kitchen. Said a cold man, he did not entertain. He did not court. He moved through his own great rooms like a guest who meant to leave them, and the only warmth in his face, the scullery maid swore, was the warmth he kept for his dead, for he visited the family vault more faithfully than he visited his drawing-room. It was his aunt who ran the house, and it was his aunt who mattered. Lady Theodosia Vauncey had married the Marquess's late uncle, and outlived him by a decade, and in that decade she had made herself the governing intelligence of Selcourt House. She managed the menus and the invitations and the accounts. She managed the servants with a small silver bell and a long memory, and above all she managed her nephew, whose grief and whose illness had left him content to be managed. She wore her late husband's diamonds and her own ambition with equal ease, and she had decided, with the serene confidence of a woman whose decisions had always come to pass, exactly how the Marquess's life was to be repaired. The estate wanted money. There was a young woman with a great deal of it. The matter, to Lady Vauncey, was as plain as a column of figures that summed correctly. The young woman was Miss Endelian Pomfret, the only child of a man who had made a fortune in the sugar trade and wished his daughter to spend it on a title. She was 24, handsome in a glassy, considered way, accomplished at the harp and at the management of a room, and she had been told from her cradle that she was meant for exactly such a marriage as this. She did not love the Marquess. She had never been required to love anyone, and the requirement would have struck her as vulgar. She intended to be a marchioness, and she intended the house to be ordered to her satisfaction, and she had taken Esme's measure on her first visit with a single downward glance, and dismissed her in a phrase that traveled to the attic by nightfall. That girl, Miss Pomfret had said to Lady Vauncey in the cool of the morning-room, is precisely the sort of creature one must never let near the good porcelain. So the house had decided what Esme was, and the verdict was unanimous, and it would have held to the end of her servitude if a footman had not fainted at a door on the night of the autumn reception, and if a tray had not been pushed into the hands of a girl who had been taught to read a fever in a face. What she had whispered to the Marquess in the frozen hush after the tea ran down his silk was this. She told him the fever was coming back, and that he had perhaps 2 hours, and that he should send for nothing the apothecary would bleed him for. She said it fast and low, and then she stepped back. Certain she had ended herself, because a housemaid does not diagnose a Marquess in his own drawing-room before 40 of his guests. He did not answer her. He turned to his aunt and said he was indisposed, and begged the company's pardon, and he left the room with a steadiness that cost him visibly, and the reception closed around the empty place he left, like water closing over a stone. Esme was sent down to the kitchen in disgrace. Lady Vauncey's silver bell rang for her twice before midnight, and each time Esme climbed the stairs, expecting to be turned out, and each time she was sent down again with the matter unsettled, because the one person who could have confirmed her ruin had shut his door, and would not open it. By 2 in the morning, the fever had him, as she had said it would, and the great house that ran on Lady Vauncey's certainty did not know what to do. With a thing that certainty had not foreseen, the Marquess lay in the blue room with the heat rising in him like a tide, and the physician his aunt summoned arrived near dawn, smelling of his bed and his brandy. Dr. Brandel was a fashionable man who attended fashionable patients, and he did what fashionable men of his profession did, which was to open a vein and draw off a basin of blood and pronounce the patient relieved. The Marquess was not relieved. By the second day he was worse, and by the second night he did not always know the room, and Lady Vauncey sat in the corridor with her hands folded and her face composed, and gave it out below stairs that his lordship was a little unwell and would mend. It was Mrs. Halsey, the housekeeper, who came down to the scullery on the second night, and found Esme scrubbing a pot she had already scrubbed, and asked her, very quietly, what she had meant by what she said in the drawing-room. Mrs. Halsey had served the family 30 years. She had a face like a closed account book, and a heart she let no one audit, and she had buried, in her time, the Marquess's mother whom she had loved. She listened while Esme told her plainly what her own mother had taught her about the fever from the Indies, how the bleeding starved a man the sickness was already starving, how the bark from the New World could break the heat if it were given in time and given right. She watched the girl's chapped, work-roughened hands while she spoke, and she heard the rector's daughter in the careful grammar that the coal and the lye had not been able to scrub away, and she made a decision that she would not have made for a stranger. She took Esme up the back stairs to the blue room while the physician slept in the library, and Lady Vauncey took the 1 hour of rest she permitted herself, and she let the housemaid look at the Marquess. He did not know Esme and his fever. He knew almost nothing in his fever. Yet when she laid the back of her roughened hand against his burning cheek, and counted the racing pulse at his throat, and saw the dryness of his lips and the way the light hurt him, she knew the sickness, the way she knew her own name, and she told Mrs. Halsey what was needed, and Mrs. Halsey, who held the keys to everything in that house, unlocked the still room. What followed, no one in the drawing room ever saw, and that is the part of the story the 40 guests could never have told. Envy. There was no public defiance. There was a girl on her knees by a Marquess's bed in the grey hours, grinding the bitter bark in a mortar she had begged from the kitchen, steeping willow and feverfew in water she had drawn herself, raising his head with one arm and coaxing the bitter draught past his cracked lips a spoonful at a time, hour upon hour, while the candle burned down, and her own knees went numb against the boards. She knew the measures by heart, 3 grains of the powder to the cup, and no more, for too much of the bark was its own kind of poison, and she had watched her mother weigh it on the little brass scale in the parsonage still-room 100 times. She wrung cloths in cool water, and laid them at his wrists and his throat, where the heat ran nearest the surface, and changed them when they warmed, and counted his pulse against the slow tick of the long case clock in the corner, so that she would know the moment the racing in him began at last to ease. Twice he surfaced into a thin wakefulness and spoke names she did not know, a man's name and a place. Soldiers' names, perhaps, the freight of those campaign years that he carried, sealed away by daylight, and she answered him low and steady as though she had known the names all her life, because her mother had taught her that a frightened body quiets to a calm voice. Whatever the words, she did not pray aloud, though her father had taught her to pray. She worked. The working was her prayer. By the gray of the 3rd morning, the fever broke. It broke the way her mother had told her it would, all at once, in a sweat that soaked the linen, and the Marquess opened his eyes in his own right mind for the first time in 2 days, and found a housemaid asleep on her knees beside him, with her cracked hand still resting on his wrist, as though even in sleep she had not dared stop counting. He did not wake her at once. He lay still in the new clarity of his recovered self, and looked at her for a long moment, and what moved behind his face in that moment he showed to no one, then or for some time after. He had come home from the fever country expecting to die a little earlier than other men, and had ordered his life around that expectation, and a girl whose name he did not know had knelt all night in the dark and refused to let him. Then Lady Vauncey opened the door. She took in the scene, the open still room beyond, the mortar, the soaked linen, the sleeping servant, with the swift comprehension of a woman who has spent a decade reading a household, and she understood at once 2 things. She understood that her nephew was going to live, and she understood that he was going to live, because of a person whose existence threatened every arrangement she had spent that decade securing. Her face, in the single instant before she composed it, showed the calculation plainly. Then it was composed, and gracious, and terrible. She thanked Esme. That was the dreadful thing. She thanked her warmly before Mrs. Ladder, Halsey and the waking Marquess. and she said how providential it was that the girl had a little country knowledge of nursing. And she had the household send up broth and a fresh nightshirt, and she had Esme sent down to sleep. And within the week, she had begun, with great gentleness and great care, to destroy her. It was done the way such things are done by clever women, which is to say it was done so that the victim's own virtues became the instruments of her ruin. Lady Vauncey praised Esme's nursing so widely that the praise became a kind of mark on her. She remarked, in the hearing of the right people, on how very educated the girl seemed for a housemaid, how very above her station, and she let the remark do its quiet work until the other servants who had pitied Esme began instead to resent her. She moved Esme from the attic to a small room nearer the family's floors, a promotion that isolated the girl from her two friends and placed her where her every movement could be observed and reported. And she watched, and she waited, and she let the Marquess's recovering attention to the maid accumulate, because she meant to use that attention too. For the Marquess had begun to notice Esme, and to do it badly. In the manner of a man unpracticed at noticing anyone at all, he found reasons to be where she was working. He came into the library when she dusted it, and stayed reading in a chair while she moved among the shelves, and he asked her once what the green book was that she carried in her apron. And when she told him it had been her mother's, he did not laugh, but asked what her mother had been, and listened to the answer. He asked her after that the names of the herbs pressed in the book, and she gave them, the willow and the feverfew, and the tansy, and the marshmallow root, and he repeated them back wrongly, on purpose. She came to suspect only to hear her correct him in the careful voice he had begun to listen for. He had her shown the conservatory at the back of the house where his late mother had grown her simples, neglected now, and gone to seed, and he watched from the door while Esme moved among the dead pots, naming what had once stood in each, and he said, very quietly, that the place might be put right again if there were anyone in the house who cared to do it. He fell into the habit of giving her small commands that were not commands at all. Sit, while he asked her something. Eat, when he saw she had not. Come in out of the passage. You will take cold. He gave them in the flat, level voice of a man who would rather be thought cold than be understood. And Esme, who had been raised in a house where love spoke softly and steadily, and never raised itself, understood him perfectly, and let herself understand nothing, because to understand it would be to hope, and hope was a luxury her station could not afford. There was a morning in the long gallery when the truth of it nearly showed itself. He had found her at the tall window, caught for one stolen moment with her chapped hand flat against the cold glass, and her face turned up to the thin winter light. And he had stopped, and the air between them had changed. He crossed the gallery. He stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the chill of the glass. He did not touch her. He said her name, Esme, the given name the first time he had used it, and the saying of it was an event in the room, a door opening in a wall that had been blank. She did not move. Her breath went shallow, and her heart sounded in her own ears. And her hand stayed against the glass, as though she had forgotten she owned it. And then a bell rang somewhere below, Lady Vauncey's bell. And the moment closed, and Esme dropped a curtsy and fled, and did not let herself feel the loss of it until she was alone. What she did not yet know was that the bell had not rung by accident, and that Lady Vauncey had been at the gallery's far door, and had seen everything she needed to see. The betrothal was announced for the night of the December ball, the largest gathering Selcourt House would hold that season. Lady Vauncey arranged it all. The Marquess, still not wholly himself, still grieving in his quiet way, and unequal to the long campaign his aunt waged across the breakfast table, had not so much consented as failed to refuse, and Miss Pomfret's father had brought his attorneys and his settlements. And the matter had the dreadful momentum of a thing that everyone but the bridegroom considered, concluded. Esme heard of it, the way servants hear of everything in fragments, in the wash-house and on the stairs, and she folded the knowledge away and went on with her work, because there had never been any other story for a girl like her, and she had been a fool to let the gallery maker forget it. It was Mrs. Halsey who carried her the worst of it, reluctantly, because she judged it kinder that Esme hear it from a friend than from a tormentor. Lady Vauncey had spoken of her at the settlement dinner, before Miss Pomfret and her father and the attorneys, and what she had said, repeated to Esme now in the housekeeper's flat, unwilling voice, was that the household had lately been troubled by a serving creature who had got above herself through a little luck with a sickbed, and that a firm hand and a new mistress would soon put such a baggage back in her place. Esme received the report without a word. She had been called many things in that house. She had not yet learned to mind it less. 3 days before the ball, the brooch went missing. It was a small thing of diamonds and sapphire that had belonged to the Marquess's mother, and it was found, after a search that Lady Vauncey directed, with grave reluctance, wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of Esme's box, in the new room Lady Vauncey had so kindly given her. Esme stood in the doorway while the housekeeper drew it out. And the cold that went through her had nothing to do with the season. She had never seen the brooch in her life. She said so. She said it steadily, because terror in her had always come out as stillness, and the stillness was read by the gathered servants as the brazen calm of a thief who had been caught. The dismissive word that had followed Esme since her first week was spoken for the third time then, and it was spoken by Lady Vauncey herself, in the full hearing of the assembled household, in the gravest and most sorrowful of voices. "A creature like this," she said, "was never anything but a thief in waiting, and she only grieved that her nephew's kind heart and his illness had blinded them all to it so long. She had the constable sent for. She had Esme's box searched to the last seam, and she had her nephew kept from the scene entirely on the grounds of his health, so that the man who might have spoken for the girl never saw her stand accused. Esme spent that night in the cold of the box-room, with the door bolted from without, waiting for the constable in the morning that would carry her to the magistrate, and she did not weep even then. She sat on the bare floor among the trunks and the shrouded furniture, with her mother's worn book of receipts held against her chest, the one thing they had let her keep, because no one had thought it worth the taking, and she went over in her mind, with the terrible clarity of the hopeless every door that had ever closed behind her. The parsonage, the valley, the gallery, and the window, and her name in his voice. There was one small window high in the wall, no wider than her 2 hands, and through it she watched the cold square of sky go from black to the iron gray of a winter dawn, and she thought, with no bitterness left in her to spend, that she had been a fool to imagine a Marquess's kindness could be anything but a danger to a girl in her place. For it was his notice that had marked her, and his aunt's fear of that notice that had ruined her. And she had walked into both, with her eyes open, because she had wanted, just once, to be seen. She had no fortune and no character, and now no honest name, and the law of England did not weigh a housemaid's word against a marchioness's. And she understood, sitting on that floor, that worth which is never witnessed might as well not exist at all. She had been witnessed, after all, in a place she had not thought to count. Jem Cosgrave was the footman who had fainted at the autumn reception, a thin, decent boy of 18 who had never quite recovered his place in the house's good opinion after the disgrace of going down at his post. He had seen something 3 days before on his way to trim the lamps in the upper passage that he had not understood at the time and had been afraid to understand since. He had seen Lady Vauncey come out of the new room that had been given to the housemaid, a room she had no reason to enter, and slip something small and wrapped into the pocket of her gown. He had told no one. A footman in disgrace does not accuse a marchioness, not if he wishes to eat. Still, he had lain awake the night Esme was bolted into the box-room, and in the grey before dawn he went and found Mrs. Halsey. Because she was the only person in that house he was less afraid of than he was ashamed of his own silence. What Mrs. Halsey did with what the boy told her was the quiet hinge on which everything turned. She did not go to Lady Vauncey, who would have crushed the tale and the boy with it. She did not go to the constable, who answered to whoever fed him. She waited until the morning of the ball, when the house was a confusion of florists and musicians, and the Marquess was at last on his feet and moving through his own rooms again, and she went to him directly, in his dressing-room, with the door shut, and she told him 3 things. She told him what Jem had seen. She told him whose knowledge had broken his fever in the blue room while he raved. And she told him that the girl who had knelt all night to save his life was bolted in the box room on his aunt's word, waiting for a magistrate accused of stealing his mother's brooch. The Marquess listened to all of it without a word. When Mrs. Halsey had finished, he asked her only one question, in the level voice his servants had always mistaken for coldness. He asked whether the girl had eaten. Mrs. Halsey said she did not believe she had. And something in his face, the housekeeper said afterward, was like ice going off a river in the spring. The first crack, and then the whole white field of it breaking up and beginning terribly to move. He did not free Esme himself, though he could have. He understood even in his anger the shape of the thing his aunt had built, and he understood that to simply release the girl by private order would leave the accusation alive in every mouth in the county, and the diamond on Miss Pomfret's finger by spring, and Esme's name a whispered byword to the end of her days. His aunt had done her work in public. It would have to be undone in public in the same room, before the same eyes, or it would not be undone at all. So he did a colder and a kinder thing. He let the ball begin. The December ball at Selcourt House was the most brilliant the season had seen, and Lady Vauncey moved through it like a general on the morning of a victory. She had already counted the great rooms blazed with 1,000 candles. Ponger! Miss Pomfret was magnificent in white, and her father's diamonds, stationed near the harp, prepared. The betrothal was to be announced at the height of the evening, after the dancing, when the company was warmest and the wine was kindest. And Lady Vauncey had every detail of it arranged, including the agreeable understanding that a small unpleasantness involving a dishonest housemaid had been quietly disposed of. At the height of the evening, the Marquess asked for the room's attention, and the company turned to him gladly, expecting the announcement they had come to hear. He did not give it. He stood where his guests had stood 3 months before on the night of the spilled tea, in the same room, beneath the same fire, and he said that before he spoke of his own future he owed the company a truth about his recent life. And the truth was that he had been 3 days from his grave in the autumn, and was alive only by the skill of one person under his roof. He said that person's name. He had Mrs. Halsey bring her in. They brought Esme up from the box room into the blaze of the ballroom in the gray gown she had been arrested in, her hair undone, her reddened hands bare, and the brilliant company drew back from her as from a contagion, and Lady Vauncey's face for one instant lost its perfect composure, and showed the thing beneath it, which was fear. Esme stood in the center of all that candlelight and all those diamonds, the lowest creature in the room. By every measure the room knew how to make, and she did not lower her eyes. She had spent her life being unseen. She found she could bear after all to be looked at, so long as she had done nothing to be ashamed of. The Marquess asked Jem Cosgrave to say what he had seen in the upper passage. The boy, white to the lips, said it. He told the room he had watched Lady Vauncey leave the housemaid's room and put a small wrapped thing into her pocket, 3 days before the brooch was found in the housemaid's box. And before the Marchioness could turn that into a servant's malicious lie, Mrs. Daypore, Halsey stepped forward with the keys of 30 years' service at her belt, and said, in the flat voice of a woman who is decided to be believed, that she would swear to the boy's honesty on any book the gentleman cared to bring, and that she had served the Marquess's mother, whose brooch it was, and that the lady would not have her own diamonds used to hang an innocent girl. The room understood. It understood all at once, the way a room does, and the understanding moved through the diamonds and the dark coats like cold water, and the eyes that had drawn back from Esme turned now slowly, terribly, toward the Marchioness and her dead husband's jewels. Lady Vauncey did not crumble all at once. She was made of sterner stuff than that, and she mounted, even then, a last defense. She drew herself up and said that this was a monstrous fabrication, a conspiracy of servants, the boy a known incompetent who had disgraced himself at his post, and the housekeeper an old woman past her judgment. And she appealed to her nephew, to the company, to common sense, to everything that had always answered when she called. She named the order she had served all her life, and demanded it answer for her now. For a moment the old hierarchy wavered on the edge of obeying her. because the room had been built to obey such women, and because it is easier to doubt a footman than a marchioness. Then the Marquess crossed the room. He crossed it without haste, in the ceremonial slowness of a man who has decided and will not be hurried, and he came to where Esme stood alone in the candlelight, and before all of them he took her cracked bare hand in his, and he raised it, and he did not let it go. The room held its breath. He looked at Esme and not at his aunt when he spoke. And what he said was short, and it was specific, and it was final. She will be my wife, and this house will thank her. He said no more than that. He did not denounce his aunt at length, did not match her cruelty with cruelty, did not strip her before the company she had ruled. He had no need. The 11 words had done it. The betrothal that was to have been announced that night was not announced. Miss Pomfret, who was no fool and had no wish to be a marchioness in a house that had just chosen its scullery over her diamonds, gathered her father and her dignity, and was gone within the hour, and was married within the year to a baronet who suited her better, and bore the Marquess no grudge worth the keeping, for she had never wanted the man, only the title, and the title had ceased to be worth the trouble. As for Lady Vauncey, she was not destroyed. The Marquess of Selcourt was not a man who destroyed. He gave his aunt the dower house at Harenfield, and an income suited to her rank, and the cold courtesy of his door closed gently, rather than slammed, and he never spoke of the brooch again to her, or to anyone. It was punishment enough, for a woman whose whole self had been the governing of that house, to be governed out of it. She understood, before she left, exactly what she had done, and exactly what it had cost her, and she carried that understanding to the dower house, and was by all accounts a quieter woman ever after. The order she had served had not answered her. The thing she could not measure had proven in the end to be the only thing that counted. Esme did not gloat. She had no taste for it, and no occasion. When the room had emptied and the candles had begun to gutter, and the great house had finally gone quiet, she stood with the Marquess by the cold hearth where the tea had once fallen, and she told him, in the plain, honest voice she had kept hidden under 3 months of stillness, that she did not know how to be the thing he had named her before, all those people that she had blacked his grates, and carried his coal and had work-worn hands, and no fortune, and no family, and nothing in the world but a little volume of her mother's receipts. He listened to all of it. Then he told her, in the level voice, that no one would ever again mistake for coldness, that he had come home from the fever country expecting to die unwitnessed, and that she had knelt all night in the dark and seen him when he could not see himself, and that a man who has been seen like that does not let the sight of him go. He said he did not want a marchioness. He said he wanted the woman who had read his death in his face and refused it. He said her name, again Esme, and this time she let herself answer it. They were married in the spring in the small Hampshire church, 3 valleys from where her father had preached, with the bees loud in the churchyard and the apple trees in bloom over the wall. And the green Hampshire valley that had cast her out received her back as a marchioness, which is the kind of justice the world arranges only rarely, and only for those who never demanded it. Mrs. Halsey came to the wedding in her best black, and wept once, privately, where she thought no one saw. Jem Cosgrave came in a new coat, his disgrace forgotten, his place in the house restored and bettered the boy, who had been afraid and had chosen at the last to be brave. The green book of receipts went with Esme to Selcourt House and was kept, ever after, in a glass case in the library where her husband could find it, and the still room was hers to govern. And the country people for 20 miles around the country seat learned that the new marchioness would come herself when the fever was in the cottages and the doctor was far, exactly as her mother had come, exactly as she had been raised to come. The Marquess of Selcourt never had another season of his old illness without her hand to manage it, and he lived in the end a great deal longer than he had once expected to live. On the first cold night of their first winter as man and wife, he found her at the tall gallery window where he had once said her name, her hand flat against the glass as it had been that morning, her face turned up to the early dark. He crossed the gallery as he had crossed it before. This time he did not stop a careful distance, away. End. He came to her side and put his coat about her shoulders against the chill of the glass, and they stood together, looking out at the first snow coming down over the gray stone and the bare trees, two people whom the world had measured wrongly and who had found, in spite of all the world's measuring, the only verdict that mattered. On the sill beside her hand lay a sprig of feverfew, dried and pressed flat, the small, bitter plant that had helped to break his fever in the blue room, that she had pressed and kept the way her mother had taught her to keep the things worth remembering. He picked it up and turned it in his fingers in the snowlight, this man who had ordered his whole life around an early grave, and he set it carefully back where she had left it. And he did not say anything at all, because some things between two people who have at last been seen do not need the saying. If Esme's long road through that gray house moved you, stay a moment in the warmth of it before you go, and remember that worth unwitnessed is worth still, and that the world's first verdict is so very rarely its last. The snow came down over Hampshire all that night, and the fire burned low and warm in the room behind them, and the rector's daughter, who had once been the lowest servant in the house, stood at her own window in her own home, and was, for the first time since the green valley of her girlhood, exactly where she belonged.